Welcome to Story Connections, where we discuss books and all the wonderful, exciting, frightening, and fascinating tales they present, and how all these things pertain to our lives. Now, here are your hosts, Kathryn, Townsend, and Rebecca Guthrie.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Guthrie, and this is Story Connections. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we are going to be talking about YA Lit, or young adult literature, and why it isn't just for teenagers. So we have picked a large selection of books to talk about, all of which we realized as we were talking about all of the books that the broad theme is unintended consequences, but in more concrete... That's not the word I want. What's the word that I want?
I don't know. I'm not sure what you're trying to say.
Okay, well, I was trying to talk about how books, all the books had themes like dealing with things like racism or suicide, but all of it ends up being about...
okay, I understand. So each of the books has its own theme.
Right, but the broad theme is unintended consequences. But we wanted to give you a little bit of background about YA literature and what it's defined as. This is the technical English lit major English teacher part of the show.
I actually think it's more like American Library Association definition.
Okay, there we go, American Library Association definition. So young adult literature is considered for between 12 and 21-year-olds. Basically, the point you drink, it's no longer considered young adult literature. Legally drink, I should say. And it specifically has the protagonist is a young adult, so a teenager or, up until they're 21. But unlike what the name is with young adult literature, it's actually not just young adults who read it. According to the Children's Books Consumer in the Digital Age, a study from Bowker Market Research, 55% of YA Lit is actually purchased by adults, and 75% of the people who purchase of that 55% say that they purchased it for themselves. So it really actually is becoming a cross-market.
Oh, good. That means when I don't have any young adults in my life anymore, I can still buy YA Lit?
Yep, that's what that means.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's exciting. So we want to talk a little bit about why YA Lit has become so popular to such a broad audience, why so many people are reading it. And I think you can really point that to Harry Potter. Because Harry Potter was a book that was marketed for children. It was supposed to be children teen book. And adults started reading it and went, wait, this is just a good story. It doesn't really matter that your protagonist starting at the age of 11 is 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, all the way up until they're 17. This is just a good story, and it's something that my kids are reading and I can relate to. And that was really...
So when you say relate to, you don't really mean relate to, because they're not going to get a letter that's going to invite them to a school of wizardry.
Unfortunately.
When you say relate to, what you mean is that the issues that the book really deals with, like loyalty and courage and, I don't know, just...
What do you do when the adults in charge
are evil?
Or the people in charge are evil or incompetent or just flat out don't care?
Right. So those are themes that just being human.
Right. I mean, we've all had that boss that you're just like, yes, Harry.
Could you say the same thing about Tom Sawyer?
You could absolutely say the same thing about Tom Sawyer.
Right. If Tom Sawyer had been written today, it would be a YA book. But Tom Sawyer would never, ever in a million years be published today.
That's true.
Wow.
And the reason it wouldn't is because it has themes and language that...
we're not politically correct.
Exactly.
Right. Well, we're actually going to be talking about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn today, because it has a teenage protagonist, and it's read by teenagers, even though it's not technically considered YA Lit. If it were published today, it would be.
Right. It's not YA Lit because it's classical literature.
Right.
Apparently you can't be both.
Yeah. Because the thing is that we all think, a lot of people who don't read YA Lit think of it as being very young and immature, and it's really, really not. And it's really, especially in the end of the 1990s into the 2000s, it's really come into its own as its own market share that really actually has a big impact. I was reading as I was getting ready for the show that young adult ebooks are being purchased at a much faster rate than any other kind of book out there, and that most teenagers don't have ebook readers of any type. So Kindle, a Nook, a Kobo, any of it. It's adults that are buying that literature, which tells you a great deal about how good the stories are, because they're good stories.
Well, part of it is that they're good stories, I think, but a big part of it is that they're very, very tightly written.
Yes, they are.
And, literature in the sense of what is
the great American novel.
Right, the great American novel, frankly, is often boring.
Yes.
Even though you're not supposed to say that.
Right.
An awful lot of what's being published as adult literature right now is just boring.
Right.
And if it isn't boring, it's hideously depressing without any kind of redeeming value.
Yes.
So why would I want to read that?
Well, I think a really good example of this is, I can't remember what year it won the Pulitzer Prize, but Confederacy of Dunces. This was a book that was written, and this is not a YA Lit book, but it was written by a man who was so depressed that he committed suicide, and his mother found this half-finished manuscript and bullied somebody into publishing it, and, we have to give the Pulitzer to a dead person. So they gave it the Pulitzer Prize. I honestly could not finish reading it. I tried, and I picked it up like 3 or 4 times because I have a goal.
It's one of those books that you're supposed to
read.
Right,
I have a goal that I wanted to read all of the Pulitzers, and I was like, you know what? My life is too short, and I am not going to try anymore. So I stopped, and I think that's, part of why people read sometimes is to escape, and you cannot escape what's going on in a book like that.
Right. So until the Hunger Games, I think for YA literature, there was a convention, sort of a agreement between author and reader that even if the ending wasn't happy necessarily, that there was a resolution that was satisfying.
Right. Well, the same thing, and we will talk about this on a different show, happened with romance novels. After ebooks were created, romance readership skyrocketed because you could read it on your Nook and nobody knew what you were reading, and so you weren't having these garish bodice ripper romance titles, and you could read it wherever you wanted, and they always have happy endings. You can pick up any romance novel anywhere in the world and it will have a happy ending.
And if it doesn't have a happy ending, it's not called a romance novel, it's called a women's novel.
Yes, it is.
Well, that saved me from reading that genre.
So anyways, to get back to young adult literature. One of the big reasons that we wanted to do this as our second show was because there is a lot of YA Lit out there that allows you to have some really tough, important conversations with teenagers and young adults in your life that you need to have conversations with if you are a parent or a mentor or a teacher. So that's going to be mostly the books that we're going to talk about today, is these heavier books. There's lots of very light stuff out there. But we wanted to talk about some of these books because we know that we have a lot of audience members who are in contact on a regular basis with and are important people in teenagers' lives, and we wanted to give you some suggestions.
Well, and not just that, but I think that these are books, many of them are books that are either assigned in school or are widely read by teenagers, and I think it's important that parents and adults know what kids are reading, because if you know what somebody's reading, you know what they're thinking about.
Right, and even if they're not thinking about that per se, they're starting to think about those conversations. We talked about it last week with Kathryn reading 1984 and me reading Fahrenheit 451, and as teenagers, and what an impact that made, the feelings that we still feel when we think about those books and where we were and why we were reading and why they matter so much.
Right. So, which of the books do you want to talk about first?
Well, let's talk about banned books first.
Okay.
And we can,
especially since many of these books have been
banned. Yes, actually. So let me start off by saying I think that banning books is one of the most evil things that you can do.
Okay, and let me interrupt to say I don't necessarily agree.
Okay, and that's fine. My feeling about it, there's a movie called 1776, and it's a musical, and it's about creating the Declaration of Independence. And in it, Stephen Hopkins, who's from Rhode Island, and he doesn't actually say this quote in real life, I wish he did, but in the movie, he's a representative from Rhode Island, and they're voting on whether or not to even discuss the idea of talking about the Declaration of Independence, and he said, there's no idea so scary that we can't even talk about it, and I'm taking out all the swear words that were in that part. but that's how I feel about it. There's no idea out there that's so scary that we can't even begin to think about talking about it, that we have to hide it away someplace dark and not talk about it. And I think in doing that, what we teach people and what we tell people is that ideas are scary and scary things are bad, and so we must protect ourselves from things that are scary, and we end up in a place that is, Fahrenheit 451, where we're burning books because people can't handle them, and that terrifies me.
Okay, and I don't disagree with the fundamental analysis there, but I do think that there is such a thing as community standards. And I think that particularly in, for instance, a private school, it is okay for parents to come together and say, some of us are comfortable with this and some of us are not comfortable with this, so can we please defer to the weaker brother and not have this particular book on the curriculum? And those parents who are comfortable with it can give it to their kids, and if they want their kids to read it and they want to talk about it, that's fine, but we don't have to do it in the classroom. I absolutely don't think that the government should be in the business of banning books. But I think it's okay if parents come together and say, we're not really comfortable with our children reading this in school.
And I don't necessarily disagree. And I will also state that I have an 18-month-old. My one child is an 18-month-old. So I have not gone through the parenting process of having older children that I need to make those decisions for. So I'm totally willing to state on record that this feeling that I have comes very strongly from 14-year-old me reading Fahrenheit 451 and being terrified of books being burned, and not so much from a parenting point of view, because right now my child likes green eggs and ham and Cat in the Hat. So, not scary books.
Right. And speaking as somebody who has 8 children, and all of them are...
So we're going to finish this sentence on the other side. This is Story Connections with Rebecca Guthrie and Kathryn Townsend.
Oh, sorry.
Miss a show? Hear the podcast through our website, kvoi.com. Intelligent weekend talk that's live and local. Only on AM 1030, KVOI, The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Hi, welcome back to Story Connections. I'm Rebecca Guthrie.
And I'm Kathryn Townsend.
And before the break, we were talking about banned books and our opinions about them.
Right, and I wasn't paying attention to the clock, so...
we're talking about having 8 kids and parenting.
Right, so I have 8 kids, and all of them needed to be parented a little bit differently, but I mostly let them read whatever it was that they wanted to read. However, I'm thinking specifically of a book like The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, which is a young adult novel, and it was read in schools, and it was extremely popular at one point. In fact, it was made into a movie, that I find, frankly, offensive, because it is an anti-Narnia, essentially, and in the end of the series, God dies. He kills him. Philip Pullman kills God off. And I didn't want my kids reading it, because I didn't think that at the point in time that they were the correct audience for that book, they were ready for the ideas that were in that book. And I think banning that book from my home was a parenting decision that was a legitimate one for me to make. But
I will also argue that if one of your kids had come to you and said, look, this is a book that everybody's talking about, and I want to be able to have some conversations with my friends about why this book matters so much to them because this is happening, that you would have been willing to consider that.
Well, that's true. I actually had one of my children come to me and said, I want to read this book, rather than putting them in a position where they were sneaking behind my back to read a book that I had said don't read. I would have read it with them.
Right. But the point is that I'm just saying I think it's okay that there are ideas for young adults that need to be presented carefully, and that there are things that are inappropriate in a school context. And I am not arguing with that fact, but I'm saying the idea of just banning books flat out just because, it has scary ideas in it leads to all kinds of unintended consequences that you don't want.
Okay, and I don't disagree with you.
So, in that vein, we're going to talk about 3 books that have been banned either now or in the past. The first one that we're going to talk about is Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and it's not The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain wrote it, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I didn't know that, and I thought it was interesting. So Huckleberry Finn, in a brief story, is about a boy that runs away with a runaway slave and their adventures, basically at its core. And when it was first published, it was banned because God forbid that a white boy and a black man have any kind of peer relationship, because, black people were slaves and not people.
Right. And, you can't encourage that kind of thing.
Right. More recently, the book has been banned because it uses racial epithets for Jim, who's the black man. And I'm sure that all of you know what those words are.
Well, the thing is that really it was the NAACP originally that said, we don't like this book. So, not originally. In the modern iteration of censorship, it was the NAACP that started that. Originally, it was hated by whites, and then
it became hated
by blacks.
And the thing is that if you've actually read the book, it's a very good book, and it's a satire, a great deal about the racial relationships between black people and white people. And Mark Twain is brilliant and has a great deal to say about why this is wrong and how people are people, and we need to treat everybody as though that they're human beings and not look at people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Thank you.
Martin
Luther King.
Yes.
Junior.
It's one of those books. I read it again this week in prep for this show, and I read it, as a teenager, and as an adult, I get a great deal more out of it. I'm able to appreciate Mark Twain's brilliance in a way that I really wasn't as a teenager. So it's definitely a book to pick up and reread if you haven't.
I think it's a book worth reading.
So the next book is To Kill a Mockingbird, and Kathryn really likes this book, so we'll let
her.
She really likes this book.
I do really like this book. So the synopsis of this book is that there's a family, and the dad, Atticus, is an attorney, and he's got 2 kids. He's a widower. He's got 2 kids, and they have a black nanny that lives with them. And there is a young black man who is accused of rape, and Atticus ends up defending this man who is innocent one summer, and it's about the living through that summer. And, I don't really understand why there's anything in this book that anybody would find objectionable. I understand that they do, but to me, it's about courage and doing what you think is right, even in the face of social disapproval. And it's about loyalty, and it's about making decisions about who are you and what do you stand for. And I think that those are ideas that everybody needs to think about. So the fact that people say, don't read this book because it's objectionable, to me means that what you're saying is, don't think about being loyal. Don't think about making hard decisions. Don't think about what you stand for. And for goodness sake, do not take a stand on anything because there might be a cost to it.
Right. So again, another book that if it was been a long time since you've read or you haven't read it, it's a pretty quick read, and it's something that you should pick up. So, and those are both, they're classic literature, so they're not considered YA lit, but they are, if you look at them, actually
they meet the criteria.
Right, they meet the criteria of YA lit, which is part of why we talked about them. But the next book that absolutely is YA lit is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and it actually was in the news recently because a whole bunch of school districts have banned it because of objectionable content. I actually, on our website, whystoriesmatter.com, have linked to a story about the police being called because they banned it in, I believe it was Idaho. It got banned in a school district in Idaho, and one of the 8th graders decided that they wanted their classmates to be able to read it, so she put up a the word just came out of petition. Thank you. Petition. And she got 350 signatures from people saying, yes, we would like to be able to read this and talk about it because it's an important thing to talk about. And she got an independent bookstore to agree that if they could raise the money, that they would bring in all the books and give the books away for free. So they did a Kickstarter and they crowdfunded it, and they got enough money to buy these books. And so she had a book giveaway where she was giving away the books to these teenagers and middle schoolers, and the parents called the police on her, and the police showed up and was like, okay, you can take the book away from them once it gets in the house because that's your right as a parent. And I absolutely agree that is their right as a parent if they don't want their kids reading it. But we're not going to arrest her for giving away free books. Anyways, the publisher found out that this was happening and sent a whole bunch more copies. So anybody in this small town in Idaho who wants to read the book can go get a free copy of A Diary of a Part-Time Indian.
So what is so scary about the part-time Indian? And I think that it's a couple of things. And I will freely admit that there are some things that Sherman Alexie talks about in that book that I think he only put in order for him to make it controversial and objectionable.
Right. I'm looking at the ALA.org banned books for 2013 and the reasons that they got sent in that it was being banned. And it says offensive language, which is true, racism, which is true, sexually explicit, nah, unsuitable for age group, nah.
Right. Well, it isn't really sexually explicit because when I think sexually explicit, I think the genre erotica.
Right.
So it's not that.
No.
But it does talk about sexual things in the context of how a 14-year-old boy would think about them.
Right.
However, it does that in a way that does not move the story forward in any way, shape, or form.
No, I agree. I hadn't read this book until Kathryn said, I think this is a book that we should talk about because it's being banned. It's being talked about. Some school districts are banning it. Some school districts aren't.
And some school districts are teaching it.
Right. Some school districts are teaching it. I hadn't read it, so I read it this week. And she had told me a little bit about it. And when we got to that particular scene, I was like, yeah, I'm really pretty sure that Sherman Alexie just put this in here to tweak the Bible Belt parents and it worked. He was very successful. He had an impact, and that's what as human beings we're all trying to do. We're all trying to have an impact. So he had an impact. But the book talks about true things. So in a brief synopsis of True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, it's about an Indian boy who lives on an Indian reservation in Washington.
Yes,
in Washington.
Yeah.
And he's very, very smart, and he realizes, because a teacher has a conversation with him, that if he stays on the reservation, going to the reservation school, that he is never going to go anywhere, that he will never be anything other than poor and drunk on the Indian reservation. So he overcomes incredible obstacles to go to the white school in town. He has to hitchhike sometimes or walk 23 miles to get to school. And he does this. And the people, they call him an apple. He's red on the outside but white on the inside. So the Indians are calling him an apple, and the white kids are all going, why are you
Indian
here? And it's about his story and his struggle and
how he comes to grips with who he is and what he wants. And how he realizes the value of what it is that he came from.
Right.
And the value of what it is that he's seeking, and how he reconciles those two things.
Right. And that they both are important, that you don't have to give up one for the other, that you can have both, not in the same way that you can have both not the same way that you have it if you just have one, but that both mean something.
And that both mean something to him.
Right.
And I actually think that there's a scene in this book where there's a basketball game that's a continuation of a rivalry. And after the basketball game, he has a realization about his own conduct.
Right.
That I think...
And how he harmed people.
Right, and how he harmed people because of it. That I think is worth overlooking everything that might be objectionable in the book, just so that you can read it with your kids and talk about the cost of unintended consequences.
Right. So we are coming up on a break, but on the other side, we will continue this discussion. You're listening to Story Connections with Rebecca Guthrie and Kathryn Townsend.
In Intelligent Talk 24/7 on 1030 KVOI, The Voice, on the web at kvoi.com. Intelligent Weekend Talk that's live and local, only on AM 1030 KVOI, The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Hi, welcome back to Story Connections. I'm Rebecca Guthrie.
And I'm Kathryn Townsend.
And we just finished a conversation about Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian and why we think that you should read it. And now we're going to talk about The Outsiders. And The Outsiders is actually a novel that's considered one of the very first true YA lit novels. It was published in 1967. And it was written by a teenager. Essie Hinton was 15 when she started writing it, and finished it when she was 16 and a junior in high school. And when she graduated from high school, she had a publishing contract for The Outsiders, and it got published. The Outsiders is a banned book. For a couple of reasons. It has gang violence, there's a murder, there's some quote-unquote sexually explicit stuff, but
by today's standards,
yeah,
it's
not at all.
Doesn't it mirror society?
It does. In the society that Essie Hinton was growing up.
And so we should have it banned because of that.
Right. Yes, as Harry, exactly, Harry. That's why we should have it banned. So really quickly, the book is about a group of young men called the Greasers who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic
socioeconomic scale.
Thank you. And the SOS, which is short for socials, who were on the wealthy side.
And I'm pretty sure it's socias.
Socias? Is that how you... Okay. Socias. Who were on the very wealthy side of the scale. And they're having their rivalry. And it's about how unfair life can be. Ultimately, really what it's about, is how unfair life is and how you can make choices to make life less unfair.
Sounds like a modern-day version of West Side Story.
Well, I don't know.
To a degree.
I don't know if I'd put it in modern day because West Side Story.
I'm not sure
late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, the movie came out in the 60s, but the musical was out in the 40s and 50s. So, but yes, very similar, except for the fact that with the West Side Story, the Jets and the Sharks are both poor, and in this, half of them aren't, and half of them are, and that's part of what makes life so unfair.
Well, I also think that the whole you try to do something good,
right,
and bad things happen,
right,
is something that kids need to come to grips with.
Right. So I hadn't read this. Again, this is a book that I wasn't recommended by my mother. It was actually recommended by my research on YA literature, because I was doing research before this so that I could talk knowledgeably about some things, I hope. And I came across this book, and I'd never read it. And I read it, and as a 27-year-old woman, I cried. I felt deep connections to Ponyboy, who's the protagonist and sort of the hero. I could remember vividly being in high school and having a great deal of the feelings that he was having about life and how just bad sometimes it can be. And so it had a big impact on me as an adult reading this book. And I think if I'd read it as a teenager, I would have totally related to it and reread it multiple times. It would have become, even though Ponyboy is a 14-year-old boy, and I will never be and never have been a 14-year-old boy, there are true things that are true regardless of whether you're male or female, that are just true of being human, that Ponyboy talks about because it's a first-person narration book.
Right. And so in the book, they have this conflict and between the two rival gangs, and somebody gets killed, and people run away, and while they're running away, they're hiding in a church, and while they're hiding in a church, a fire breaks out, and they rescue some kids, and then there are consequences for that.
Right. And it's actually a really very powerful story. But again, it's banned because it talks about true things. And if I had a 14 or 15-year-old child, maybe even a 13-year-old child, I think I would give them this book and say, I think you should read this book, and I'd like to have a conversation with you about it, because I remember being a teenager, but I also remember being a teenager and knowing that adults were some of the most stupid people on the face of the planet. They knew nothing. They would never know anything. I was sure that I was smarter than most of the adults that I had around me. And this book would have been would have been able to give me to have a conversation with some of the adults, because we could have talked about the book and how the characters are feeling, as opposed to me and how I was feeling.
Well, and I actually think that that's one of the reasons why YA literature is important. For example, I have a child who was in the middle of a suicide cluster. Several of her friends committed suicide.
Right.
And that was her junior year of high school. And it's difficult to talk about suicide with your children. I mean, it's difficult to talk about suicide, period. It's difficult to talk about suicide with your children. And it's really difficult to talk about suicide when your kids' friends are committing suicide.
Yes.
And
with no real reason.
Right, with no real reason. I mean, they felt like they had reasons.
Right.
But it was definitely a teenage angst permanent solution to temporary problems that they could not see were temporary problems.
Right.
I am not trying to discount the kind of pain that they were feeling, because I know that it was significant. But they really were temporary problems. So there was a book that I came across called 13 Reasons Why. And it's about a young woman named Hannah Baker who commits suicide, but she leaves behind tapes that... Cassette tapes that she has recorded the reasons why she committed suicide, what drove her to feel like that was her best option. And each side of the tape, each tape, is addressed to a particular person who contributed to her suicide.
Right. So at the beginning of the book, Hannah is already dead, and she's sent these tapes to one of the 13 people on her list, and it's interspersed between his reaction to what he's listening to and her telling her story.
And that book gave me an opening to talk to my daughter about why people do the things they do and what we may not see from the outside that they're experiencing internally. And it also gave me an opportunity to talk about, we don't always know how we impact people.
Right.
Because that's a lot of what was going on with Hannah Baker, is that people were hurting her and impacting her, and they didn't know. Some of them knew. Some of them were just venal. But many of the people who impacted her did not do it on purpose to hurt her. They were so concerned with what their own experiences were that they were not thinking at all about how what they were doing was impacting anybody else. And truthfully, that's part of being a teenager. Part of being a teenager is being extremely self-focused. And I don't mean self-centered. I mean self-focused. You know, when you're a teenager, part of what you're thinking about is just, how is this impacting me? How is this impacting me? How is this impacting me?
And also, how are other people looking at me?
Right, and also, how are other people looking at me? And teenagers often imagine that people are thinking things about them that they're not thinking.
Or that they're thinking about them when they're not thinking about them at all, when they're too busy thinking about themselves.
Right. So I felt like this book just was a really strong venue for me to talk to my daughter about really important, hard issues.
Right, but it's been banned because it talks about suicide. But in this day and age, especially when you can't seem to turn on the news without somebody killing themselves, some teenager killing themselves over something that happened on Facebook or on Twitter or online somewhere, you can't not have these conversations with your kids, because even if you're not having conversations with your kids, they're having these conversations somewhere. And so you really, I think, want to have those conversations before somebody else can have those conversations, so that you can sort of frame the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
So along those lines, the next book we're going to talk about is we were talking about 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. The next book we're going to talk about is The Disreputable History of Frankie Landau-Banks by E. Lockhart. And again, this follows the unintended consequences can really hurt people. So Frankie Landau-Banks is a girl who the summer between her freshman and sophomore year grows into herself and becomes a knockout. And she goes back to her boarding school and she dates the most popular senior boy. And she figures out that he's part of a secret society that, you know,
has been happening at this exclusive boarding school since the 50s.
Right. And she wants to be a part of it because she wants
to feel important.
Right.
She wants to feel included.
She wants to feel like she belongs.
Right.
But it's a boys-only club, and the boys won't talk about it, but she finds out about it. And so she creates this elaborate plot to become basically the leader of this club and get the boys to do all kinds of pranks that they think that somebody else is telling them. They think that their actual leader is telling them how to do. And she gets them to make all of these really important political statements to a teenager.
Right, they're not really
important, but
she
thinks they are. And when she's finally discovered, the consequences of that are actually life-altering in terms of people's ability to go on and be successful. Right. And she has to deal with the fact that this thing that she did because she wanted to belong could really, 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 really ruin the rest of some people's lives.
Right. And then she has to take responsibility for what it is that she did.
Right.
But, you know, the book really focuses on Frankie.
Right.
But the student that she's pretending to be, and I don't want to give away the story.
Right.
The student that she's pretending to be could have avoided those consequences had he been willing to stand up and say, hey, it's not me.
Right.
But because the pranks were clever and because all of the men in the club were admiring him, he wasn't willing to say, it's not me.
Right, because he wanted to feel important and like he belonged. And that, you know, again, is something that's very important to teenagers. Even the people that want to feel like they're on the outside, you know, the goth movement was big when I was in high school. Okay, there were a whole bunch of goth people. I mean, they were all loners by themselves together, you know?
They were conformists to nonconformity.
Right. So when we come back, we will do our book recommendation of the week. You are listening to Rebecca, Guthrie, and Kathryn Townsend on Story Connections.
Intelligent local and national hosts. 1030 KVOI, Tucson's intelligent voice. Intelligent weekend talk that's live and local. Only on AM 1030 KVOI, The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Welcome back to Story Connections. So before the break, we were talking about unintended consequences, and we just wanted to wrap that conversation up.
Right. Well, we were talking about Frankie Landau-Banks, and that a lot of what is important in that story is unintended consequences. But I think that all of the books that we've talked about today have an element of unintended consequences. And for teenagers, I think that's a particularly important thing to talk about, because where teens screw up, where they actually make decisions that destroy the rest of their lives, is because they do not anticipate the consequences of their actions. And books can help them do that. Books can help them think about, if I do this, what could happen? Because they can read about, hey, so-and-so in this book did this, and this is what happened. So it gives you a venue to talk about those things with your kids. But if you were to read all of these books and you were to talk about unintended consequences, did they think about what was going to happen? I think that is a really easy way for you to start encouraging teenagers to be thinking before they act. Because as a parent, I know that that's one of the hardest things to teach a child to do, is to think, what did you think was going to happen? Because all too often the answer is, oh, I don't know. Well, you know what? Part of being an adult is having to take responsibility for your actions, having to deal with the consequences of what you do. And literature provides a way for you to teach your kids how to do that without them actually having to make real-life mistakes.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why young adult literature is so important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So the last series that we're going to talk about is called The Protector of the Small series by Tamora Pierce. It's a 4-book series. And if you're looking for your gateway drug to YA Lit, this is a good series to start with.
Also, fantasy.
Yes, it's fantasy. And it's about a girl who decides that she wants to become a knight, and they have set up a system so that she can do that, but she's the only girl who's taken advantage of it in the 10 years that the system has been in place. And it's about her struggles to become a defender, because she was put in a position where she couldn't defend herself and she couldn't defend people who were being harmed, and she wanted to never, ever, ever be in that position again. So she does what she needs to do so that she's not. And again, it's unintended consequences.
Right, it is.
But it's much, I don't want to say fluffier, but much lighter than all of the other books that we've...
Well, it's happier.
It's happier, yes. And it has happy endings. There are happy endings.
Right. So the protagonist, it's a series of 4 books, and the protagonist becomes a knight, and she does knightly heroic things. But all the way through, she's growing as a character. She's meeting challenges. She's overcoming challenges. But the challenges that she's meeting are ones that kids can see themselves being able to meet.
Right.
So none of them are so big and huge and heroic that you're like, well, I could never do that.
Right.
They are all sort of baby steps. And I think that makes
And they get harder the older she gets.
They get harder the older she gets. So she grows into the challenges. And I think that the thing that's really appealing about Protector of the Small is that it's so accessible.
Yes. Yes. And it's also a really good book to give to somebody who doesn't particularly like reading. If they're like, I don't like reading and there's boring, this is a good place to start. So those are the YA books that we wanted to talk about. Now it's time for our Book of the Week recommendations, and we want to thank our sponsors for this, David Guthrie with Coldwell Banker, and Susanna Lynn Photography, and you can find more information about them on our website, whystoriesmatter.com, or on our Facebook page, Facebook.com/whystoriesmatter. So, Kathryn.
Okay, so one of the books that we didn't talk about today that I think that we should have, and we just didn't get to it, is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. And so I'm going to switch my book recommendation to The Fault in Our Stars.
Okay, if you're on the website, this is not what's on there.
So it is a book about a young woman who has cancer. And it is a book about a young man who has cancer. And it's about the relationship that they develop. And she calls herself at one point a grenade, because she's going to die, and when she dies, there's going to be damage. She's going to hurt people, and she doesn't want to hurt people. So she begins to restrict her contacts as much as she can so that she doesn't hurt people. And there's a young man who says, I want to know you. And there are things about him that she doesn't know, and they develop this incredibly rich friendship. And I'm not going to give away the ending, but again, some of the most important things that I've ever read are at the very end of this book.
Yes.
And if you need something to talk to your kids about in terms of death or decisions or self-sacrifice or just making the world a better place because of the choices that you make, this is a book that lets you do that.
Yes, that is very true.
And it's going to be a movie. And
is it?
It is. I have no idea if it's going to be any good as a movie. And I find myself sort of wishing that it weren't going to be a movie, because in my experience, movies really diminish the literature. So my recommendation is that you read it before you see the movie.
Yeah, I read it as well, and yes, the end of that book speaks truth in a way that you can't say anything other than it is truth. So again, that was The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. My book is a serious book, but it has a happy ending, and it's high fantasy because there's magic, but there aren't any elves. People always seem to think that those two go together, and they don't. High fantasy really just means it has magic in it. But it's a book called Crown Jewel by Sherwood Smith, and it's actually two books that got combined into one. Crown Jewel was the first one, and Court Jewel was the second one, but it got combined into one book. And it is a book about a girl who lives in a kingdom where the king is just evil and corrupt, and everybody knows that the king is evil and corrupt, but most of the people who are in the position of power, they could do something about it, either like the fact that he's corrupt because they're getting something, or they're too afraid to do anything because if they did something, people that they love might get hurt. And so our heroine and her brother decide, you know what, this is not okay, and we're going to say that it's not okay, and we're going to do something about it. And so they basically declare civil war, and it's about the Civil War, and then it's about the consequences after the Civil War and how you rebuild a kingdom. And it's one of my favorite books. I read it for the first time when I was 14, and about every year I go back and reread it. And I know the story backwards and forwards. I can quote some of the lines, but it's speaks to me every single time that I read it, and every single time I read it, I find something new. And if I don't fangirl very much, practically never, but Sherwood Smith, if I ever met her, is one of those people that I completely fangirl over because every single one of her books I love, and every single one of her books I think has something important to say. But this is a good introduction to who she is and what she writes. So
and also to high fantasy.
So that is pretty much our show. We hope that you will join us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/whystoriesmatter or whystoriesmatter.com. Next week we are going to be talking about mothers. It's Mother's Day. So all of the men out there who might not remember that, this is your public service announcement. It's Mother's Day. You've got a week. Figure something out. But we're going to be talking about books about mothers, books by mothers, books for mothers. So if you have a recommendation for a book that you think we should have on the show, we would really like to hear that because we're always interested in learning, reading new books. One of the books that we're going to be talking about, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to get through this without crying, but it's a book called I'll Love You Forever. And I had read this book not as a mother, and when I'd read it not as a mother, I was like, this is a really sweet book, and I really like it. And then as I was reading it to my 2-week-old, and I'm actually sitting here thinking about it, makes me tear up, I cried so hard holding my new son that I could not get through the book because it had so much impact. So that's one of the books we're going to be talking about. It's a children's book. It's a picture book. And we will be talking about that. We might, I'm not sure what else we'll be talking about, but this is Story Connections with Rebecca Guthrie and Kathryn Townsend. We hope to see you on our Facebook page, facebook.com/whystoriesmatter or whystoriesmatter.com, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much for joining us.